This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. I'm here with Andrew Kavasilas at the United in Compassion 2017 conference, Symposium, I should say, in Melbourne. Andrew, take us through a little bit of your background.
I suppose in relation to what we're talking here, I've been growing cannabis varieties, high and low THC, in New South Wales under permit, various permits since 1999.
Which really surprised me, I've got to say. This is government permit since 1999.
Yes. And you know, I mean, they're all long stories how this came about, but suffice to say, in 2001, the New South Wales government issued a permit for us to cultivate 20 high THC plants, but it turned out the government didn't have the authority, the Commonwealth or international authority, to issue that permit. And so we really, and it's sort of where the argument lies, not just here in Australia, but all around the world, that where governments can't really authorise. Governments don't own cannabis, especially medical cannabis for science and medical research, as described by the UN drug conventions. No government owns it.
This is stunning to me. So are you saying that the whole question of access really sort of stemmed, or the issues with access really sort of stems from the requirement of the country of Australia to adhere to the
international drug convention, just like the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And so even though we see in Canada and in some states in America where they have introduced medical cannabis regimes, it's very, very important to know that those governments, the state and federal governments, they all fought against them. They did not want the citizens to have medical cannabis. What happened in the US states, and this has been talked about over and over, but especially here, the argument here in Australia is not picking this up. In the American Constitution, they have what they call citizens-initiated referendums. We don't have that in our Constitution. That started in 1990, well, it's been in the Constitution, but where medical cannabis started in the modern era was, say, not in 1996, when a gentleman by the name of Dennis Perron got the required number of signatures on a petition, and at the next federal election, there was a ballot for, president or not. But in all the states, there's always referendum questions as well, citizens-initiated referendums. Dennis Perron got Proposition 215 up, which was medical cannabis. But it's important to know that the Californian government ran a no campaign. They got extra money from the federal government to run a no campaign. The medical profession was against it, but when the people voted, they voted for it. And that's been the exact same case in all those states. In fact, the more recent recreational proposition that passed in California, the government was opposed to it. In fact, they got extra money from pharmaceutical companies and the federal governments to run no campaigns. In Canada, for instance, they have a Charter of Rights introduced by Pierre Trudeau in the 70s, I believe. That gives, again, the people, the citizens, some rights. There was a high court, there was a series of court cases, what they call the Allard Wilcox case, that went to the High Court. The High Court found in favour of medical cannabis use for these particular patients, and under the Charter of Rights has the authority to order the government to introduce a medical cannabis regime, which they did, and it specifically gave the government 1 year. The government took 2 years, and it was a failed attempt, really, and it really fell away. And we've just seen a series of other regimes introduced by the Canadian government. I think there's like 3 grey areas going. There's a black market, obviously, still, and there is a kind of a white market. But it's important to note that, that this is the rest of the world and countries are subject, or governments are subject to the same thing.
Now, you mentioned something very interesting to me.
Yeah.
We're all au fait with the term black market,
Yeah.
and it's got a very seedy undertone. Indeed, that's where ostensibly the issues of cannabis as a gateway drug occur from, because the other harder drugs, the other illicit drugs, are available from those sort of people, and so of course they're more likely to be able to procure them. But I'm interested in that term that you said about white market.
Oh, that's the licensed producers that are in Canada at the moment. There's a series of companies. So when I said governments don't own cannabis, as described by the United Nations Drug Convention, no government in the world. It's owned by a very small number of companies in the world, and most all of those are not internationally recognised. And we're seeing now the problems Australia is having with trying to import even from these other countries. There is international blockages and stoppages there.
Yeah.
The binding thing is the International Drug Convention, which all the countries are signatory to, and the payoff is the big pharmaceutical companies offer even distribution of drugs for all our health systems all over the world. And that was the payoff, basically. But in turn, governments had to spend a lot of money on this prohibition. They had to put, policing a black market.
Yeah, so would one of the issues there be that import would be seen as smuggling?
No, the import is that the companies that have now established in Canada, for instance, are not recognised internationally. They are not recognised wholly by the United Nations or the INCB, the International Drug Control Board. So and every country's in the same situation. I mean, we've seen some beautiful presentations here but all relating to why cannabis should be legalised, whether it's on the patient's behalf, and again, the media is what's driving this. The media pick up another story. It's almost cyclic now. We can see media picking up another hard case story of a child or a patient and presenting it to a politician who has to react. And of course, the lobbying has been quite hard. I think the lobbying and the debate and even the argument and even things like this are not really addressing the real issues. I'm talking to people who, say that they're very experienced, and once I start talking about the United Nations and no government's ever willingly introduced a meaningful medical cannabis regime, their eyes glaze over and they don't understand it. But that's where we're at. And we have to understand.
So we're asking the wrong questions.
Oh, yeah.
What's the right question?
The right question is, why isn't medical cannabis legal? Why isn't it? Why has it taken so long? I mean, some of us that have been here doing this for a long time, in New South Wales, we had the Premier Bob Carr back in the early 2000s. I mean, the New South Wales government put an incredible amount of resources into getting medical cannabis research. And it was at that time that we were issued a permit to grow. And then we became quite aware and almost subject to some backlash internationally, because there was, somebody had grown 20 high THC plants. Not so much that we'd grown them, but then to do the testing of those in a licensed laboratory using proper machinery, gas chromatography and so forth, you have to buy purified cannabinoids, Delta 1, Delta 2, Delta 9, 8.
Oh, as reference chemicals you're talking?
Yeah, standards, what they call standards, to calibrate your machine.
Yeah.
We in fact had to buy them from Israel, from Sigma. But that kind of hit the international triggers, that there was a little university down in northern New South Wales that's studying high THC cannabis. And because of the blanket ban on that kind of thing, yes, we were visited and we got talked to about doing that, and that just simply wasn't on. So you really have to put it in context.
So this is something that's really interesting me, is that it almost seems like because of a preconceptive bias, that the wrong questions are being asked by politicians, by health advisors, by bureaucrats.
This is cyclic. This is, for us in this sort of lobbying field, we just see the politicians come and go. There is a few bureaucrats who understand the situation but are bound by policy. And then, of course, you can't underestimate the power of lobbying. I mean, the health lobby is very, very strong. They're very well connected with state governments and federal governments, not just here in Australia, but around the world. These are companies that are in the top 100 entities of the world. I can see your eyes glazing over. Yeah, because it is undoing 80 or 90 years of prohibition is very difficult. It is a long story.
When I said about the wrong questions being asked, I wonder, is it ignorance or mischief?
It's ignorance and the perception. We're getting the Israeli doctors and they're coming here, but I don't think people are listening to them. We've got a very small handful of Israeli doctors who are travelling the world talking about their work with medical cannabis. But that's kind of it. That's them. They're telling us the medical profession in Israel have not embraced medical cannabis. We've had doctors explaining the route that a patient has to go through to get medical cannabis, and you're still not being prescribed. When people say, these qualified speakers are saying up on a stage, and even with you, that, doctors are prescribing cannabis in the US and Canada, they are not. Medical cannabis, as we call it, as we see it overseas, and you really have to understand this, is an exemption to smoke high THC cannabis, recreational cannabis, whatever you want to call it. That's what medical cannabis is. Here in Australia, it's like the government and around the world have misappropriated that term and saying that they're introducing medical cannabis, but they're actually not. All the government can do is create laws and the atmosphere here in Australia and everywhere to allow companies to come here to develop cannabinoid medicines. and go through whatever TGA process that would allow
And you're
them
talking pharmaceuticals here, not
we're
the
talking
whole
prescribable medicines.
Right.
Prescribable medicines, and anyone with a medical background should understand what they're saying when they say, well, prescription for a doctor writing a prescription. The doctor can only write your prescription for something that's registered, that you go to a pharmacy and pick it up from. That's not happening anywhere in the world. It's not like doctors are writing prescriptions in any big amount, and patients are going normally like any other drug and going to a chemist or pharmacy and picking it up. That's not happening. That's what the government is offering us. But we're thinking we're getting medical cannabis. And as I explained earlier, those medical cannabis regimes were introduced against those governments' will.
One last question. It's to do with farming practices.
Yes.
And, there's this issue of the hydroponics, and they're laced with things and you don't know what's in them. You don't know the care that's been taken in the manufacture and the growing and what sort of phytochemical profile they are.
Yes.
How's it done well, and what do you need to be aware of?
Look,
I guess I'm not talking recreational, I'm not for recreational, but for medicinal cannabis users who can't access that, they need to access it somewhere. Unfortunately, the government medico-loopy thing is stopping reasonable access to well-controlled, well-grown stuff, and so these people are having to resort to being a criminal for their sick child.
Absolutely.
And so my
That's
issue
prohibition.
is how do you...
The prohibition is the problem.
How does one avoid the bad products?
How does one avoid it? I mean, the government has to, on a one-to-one basis, you find somebody who is growing. I mean, medical cannabis is happening in Australia. Medical, where people are accessing black market recreational grade cannabis of various standards and various cleanliness and also products made from that. So totally unregulated. And you just have a prohibition. I just keep reminding people, and the analogy is very well there. Under alcohol prohibition in the US, obviously none of us were here, but we heard about what it was like. Basically, you couldn't get a light alcohol beer, you couldn't get a wine or a civilised scotch, but there was moonshine everywhere. And so it's the same thing. Now, some people might have been making great moonshine. Other people may not have been. Here in Australia, we're looking at, I think out of Curtin University, a guy called Clements estimated the Australia, and this is over 10 years ago, the Australians spend $5 billion a year on recreational cannabis. That's twice the size of the wine industry, and it's all unregulated. Now, of course, it's gone because prohibition has lingered and continued on. What people were smoking in the 60s, 70s, 80s is a lot different now. Now we have the equivalent of moonshine. I suppose it started off, that indoor. But what we're seeing overseas, whether it's Amsterdam in the earlier days and in the other countries where medical cannabis is taking off, and even recreationally for climatic reasons, indoor growing is obviously the preferred method of growing. And there are good ways of doing it. There are people who talk about, it's not the same and it doesn't work as well and there's not enough this compound and that compound. Look, we simply don't know. But what we do know is the market has dictated for millions and millions of people around the world that indoor growing is quite okay as a medical cannabis, as even and especially for the cultivation of cannabis that will be used for the development of pharmaceuticalised cannabinoid medicines in the future. But I think in the meantime, we really have to look at the focus of the debate, and we have to look at, I think a very good example is more recently the Canadian government, although it was against medical cannabis, but through lobbying and through particular promises, Justin Trudeau made prior to the election that he would legalise recreational use of cannabis. You see that the government there sat down, developed a plan, put it in a format that they could table at the United Nations. And that's what we're talking about here. Australia, if we want medical cannabis, the Australian government has to sit down and agree to it, develop...
But Canada did it.
Canada on recreational, okay, we still see...
Still not on medicinal?
Not on medicinal. They're accepting it more and more. The United Nations is accepting it more and more. And as we're seeing, various countries around the world, us especially, are even bending our laws to give some companies over there some kind of international legitimacy. And, to some extent, over and above what's being offered here in Australia. The big problem is that the lawful source as described under the UN. So all of, the high THC cannabis that is grown here in Australia is really excluded from even companies that want to start the development of that kind of a program to develop a prescribable cannabinoid medicine.
Andrew, you haven't just got a wealth of growing experience in your mind, but you've got a wealth of the actual regulatory and political framework in your mind. So I thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you
on
very
FX
much.
Medicine.
Thanks, Andrew. Ta.
This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook.